So I do a lot of traveling. Hi, my name is Dave McClure. I'm the founding partner at 500 Startups. We're a venture capital firm headquartered in Silicon Valley, but also here in Mexico City. We currently have about $100 million under management, a little bit more than that. And we've invested in a lot of companies, thank you very much, over the last 4 years. In fact, we've invested in over 700 companies across about 40 countries. I'm going to talk a lot about whether those startups stay in local markets or go global. About 200 of the 700 or so companies we've invested in were outside the US, and actually about 60 of those here in Mexico. Just one basic thing when we're looking at whether we invest in global markets, there's probably 3 things that we care about. The number of people, and that's not just the number of people in the population. Sometimes it's the number of people who speak a certain language or who have access to a certain number of internet-enabled devices, which might be computers or might be mobile phones, might be smartphones, not just mobile phones, or might be tablets like I'm holding right now. And then also the amount of income that those people have, and really within that, actually the amount of money that they might spend online. So the number of users, either by a language or geography, the amount of spend that they have, or the portion that they spend online, and the percentage that have internet access or have access to a specific type of internet device. That gives an overall aggregate amount of online spend that might be within a particular language or geography. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there's several reasons why companies might want to stay within their local market, or they might want to go to a different market or go to a global market, and I'll talk about those as well. Really briefly, who am I? I've been a geek in Silicon Valley for over 25 years. Started out as a developer and engineer, was also the founder of a small startup company. After that, I also worked at PayPal for a few years before the company went public, and then subsequently after it got acquired by eBay. Since I left PayPal in 2004 and now, I've been investing in startup companies, both as an angel investor for the first 5 years, and then as a VC or venture capitalist over the last 5 years. Our fund, 500 Startups, is global. We are a venture capitalist, but we also run an accelerator program, 2 programs in San Francisco and Mountain View, and 1 program here in Mexico City. Like I mentioned, we've invested in over 700 companies. We have about 30 people on the team, and some of those are located in other countries like Mexico, Brazil, also Southeast Asia and China. And we've made a number of investments in companies here in Mexico, about 60 to date, and probably close to 100 in the overall Latin America region, with some specific emphasis in Brazil. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. So about 200 of the companies we've invested in are outside the US. Many of those have come to the US and are appealing to global markets, but a lot of them are also in large enough domestic markets that they don't have to come to the US. And in particular, Brazil, China, India, Mexico, Indonesia, and maybe even Turkey and some others like Japan and Korea and Germany have large enough local markets that they really don't have to go global if they don't want to, and there's plenty of reasons why they might stay local. So why did we start doing all this traveling? Well, about 4 or 5 years ago, I started doing this trip called Geeks on a Plane, and that was really an opportunity for me and my friends to learn more about technology and investing in different parts of the world. Over the last 5 years, we've done 15 trips to over 30 countries. We've had several hundred people come with us, mostly entrepreneurs and some investors. And we've visited about 30 or 40 countries around the world. In particular, we've come to Latin America 3 times and Mexico twice. As a result of doing that, we got a lot of familiarity with different types of markets, in particular different type of languages. And I would present to you there's probably 4 languages that have very significant impact over the long term, largely because of size. Those are English, Mandarin, Spanish, and Arabic. English and Chinese or Mandarin, probably over 1 billion speakers, and Spanish and Arabic, probably 300 to 500 million speakers and growing. In addition to those global languages, there's also critical factors that help startups get off the ground. Obviously, capital is one of them, but education and mentorship is another part of that. Probably what's most important is the early stages of capital. So not necessarily large amounts of investment, but really incubation, seed, and possibly early Series A capital. Really between 0 to maybe $2 million to $5 million is what's essential in the first year or two of those companies' lives. The positive thing about the rest of the market, I guess I should say, or the market that's maybe not the US or Europe, is it's growing. Most of the growth in the world is not happening in the US, and it's not happening in Europe. It's happening in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in the Middle East, and Africa. A lot of those markets are still developing, but the growth opportunities and potential in those markets are tremendous. And they're not happening on traditional devices necessarily like PCs or even laptops. They're happening primarily with mobile phones, smartphones, and in the future they're probably happening in other platforms such as automobiles, in the home or in kitchens, and maybe even on wearables like clothing. Also, last point is there's a lot of people who are wealthy and travel around the world, so they don't just stay in their own markets. In fact, recently in San Francisco, a competitive taxi service to Uber just launched that specifically appeals to Mandarin speakers. So this is a service for Mandarin speakers in the United States in San Francisco. Not necessarily what you would expect. So going back to those global languages, why do I think those are important? Well, English is probably the first language, or native language, to maybe 1 billion speakers, but it's probably also the second language for half the planet. A lot of people conduct business in English, particularly online businesses are typically conducted in English, and there's a lot of people who spend money who speak English who are at the highest levels of income spending. However, it's relatively modest growth. The language itself is growing, but the number of people who speak English not necessarily growing quite that much. Similarly, Mandarin, over 1 billion speakers, many of them now online. Actually, some of the largest carriers in the world are now Chinese mobile carriers. They have modestly high levels of GDP and a few parts of society very high levels, but growth is actually not dramatic, at least in the population. There's not necessarily huge growth in the Chinese population. And then Spanish and Arabic, and here what's interesting is there may be between 300 to 500 million speakers of those languages, but they're mostly not online just yet, or they're still coming online. Pretty large adoption of mobile phones and smartphones, modest levels of GDP that's still growing, but very large and growing middle classes. Of course, there's many other languages around the world that have 50 to 100 million speakers, but those 4 in particular, very large language speakers. Okay, there's a bunch of other markets that might be interesting in addition to the US and Europe. I mentioned some of them before. And really some of the most incredibly growing markets are not in the places you would normally think. In Africa, probably half of the top 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. Places like Nigeria, which have close to 200 million people. And the overall nation of Africa will probably be twice the size in just another 10 to 20 years. So even though maybe modest levels right now, going to be growing quite dramatically over the next few years. Similarly, again, Middle East and Southeast Asia, India and Pakistan are also some of the largest growing economies around the world. So when I was talking before about how do we assess these global markets? Okay, so there's pretty much 3 factors. The first one is the number of people who speak that language. The second one is the amount of internet usage, and that might be different based on device. So although there may be larger number of users who have access to the web via PCs or mobile phones, amount of smartphone penetration may still be below 20 to 50% in many markets. And then similarly, the amount of money that's available to spend online, and some of that is also tied into their ability to use online payment methods to spend. So in some places, particularly like Mexico and Brazil, there may be lots of people who actually can spend money online, but they may not always have online payment methods available. What we've noticed is actually in markets where smartphone penetration and access to online payment methods increases above 30 to 50%, we start seeing a lot more activity in startups. So in particular, access to credit cards or methods of payment like PayPal or carrier billing, and the number of smartphones and whether the penetration in that audience is over 30 to 50%. Multiply all 3 of those together, and then looking at growth rates along each of those gives you a sense of how much money might be spent online within a particular geography or within a particular language that might cross geographies. There's many other factors that might affect whether it be interesting to invest in those markets. Some of them may be also based on not just the online component, but the offline component. So physical goods for delivery and how well logistics are able to get to different parts of those countries or metros. Whether social media usage is broad-based in those markets, and whether there are platforms for social media usage that are already in widespread use. And sometimes there are even really three markets in one. In places like China, India, Brazil, even here in Mexico, there may be different sets of services that are offered to the top 5 to 10% of the population, different sets of services offered to the middle class, and different sets of services offered to the population which may not have very much internet access at all, but might be a large percentage, 30 to 50% of the population, might still have access to services like SMS, or the ability to share internet devices and then still have access to certain things like education or shopping online. One of the most important things to realize is how much the world has changed in just the last 5 to 10 years. In particular, the ability to access customers on online platforms has dramatically shifted in really just the last 5 to 10 years, and particularly in the last 5. Probably what's most noticeable about that, platforms on the far right that are noted there, particularly WhatsApp and WeChat. WhatsApp, a service that was bought by Facebook for $19 billion. That service did not exist more than 3 or 4 years ago. And it also had access to hundreds of millions of users, probably 300 or 400 million users around the world. WeChat, a service that's initially developed in China by Tencent, now also has users outside of China in markets like Southeast Asia and even here in the US, probably 500 million users. So as many of these platforms are available and accessible to other startups, those startups can take advantage of them to get access to those customers via platforms such as search, like Google, social, like Facebook and Twitter, mobile, like Apple and Android, and even other content platforms like YouTube for video, Pinterest and Instagram for photos, and SoundCloud and Spotify and others for music. So there's several platforms that have hundreds of millions of users, some of them even have billions of users, and those didn't exist more than 5 to 10 years ago. So now, why should you not go global? What's the factors in why you might want to remain in a specific market? Well, in general, those factors are probably that you don't really speak English that well, and that the local market has 50 to 100 million users already in it. If you already have 50 to 100 million people in your market, or maybe 100 to 200 million in developing markets, they're big enough. You actually don't need to go global to develop those businesses. If you do go global, some of the challenges are, can you actually operate in that other language, in that other culture, in that other geography well? While it might be easy for some people to operate in English or Mandarin-speaking environments, it might not be easy for everyone. Also, there might be a lot of rich customers in certain markets. So markets like Saudi Arabia, which only has 30 million people, or Japan, which only has 100 million, are actually great markets. There's not a lot of people who are developing businesses for Arabic speakers or for Japanese speakers, and so the level of competition with other entrepreneurs is much lower. Furthermore, there might be just a family situation where you have kids, or you have, a wife or a spouse or a husband that aren't going to just necessarily get up and move with you to Beijing or New York. On the other hand, there are still lots of reasons to go global. Obviously, if you live in a small country, you might want to be developing for a larger market, but there's plenty of other reasons as well. For the most part, there are probably several large geographies that are interesting. That might be the US market or overall English-speaking market, might be the EU or the European market, and again, might be the Chinese market. I could also suggest that Mexico or Spanish-speaking markets in Brazil might be large markets for people in other Latin American countries that aren't quite as large. In some of those places, there's a lot of rich customers and a lot of online customers. Particularly in Silicon Valley, there's not just a lot of rich people, but also a lot of platforms and partners. So you may want to go there not just because of the market, but also because of access to capital or access to talent. And of course, if you like watching action movies and rap videos, there may be other reasons to come to California or New York, and I won't deny those are compelling. One thing I'd like to bring up is AngelList is a company that provides access to capital and startups all over the world. It's primarily based in the US right now. Full disclosure, we're an investor. But AngelList is now starting to be used globally. In fact, we use AngelList for our application process here in our Mexico City office with Spanish-speaking startups. We have many startups in India that register on AngelList and many in other parts of the world as well. Primarily, it's a platform for startups and investors to find out about each other and meet, but it's also a platform that collects activity and metrics on startups, even about their customers, and plenty of other talent and job opportunities as well. So what are critical ecosystem factors? I think a lot of people overemphasize Silicon Valley being something that's different from the rest of the world, and it's not really the case. Silicon Valley is not so different, it's just that it's had a lot more time, probably about 70 years. So there's been multiple generations of entrepreneurs and investors that have developed in Silicon Valley, and there's just a lot more confidence and experience in Silicon Valley. And so what I primarily call the Silicon Valley thing is really just optimism and belief. And that's something that can exist everywhere. It doesn't have to be just in Silicon Valley. Now, the other things that I list here, access to knowledge, people, infrastructure, particularly product and customers, monetization, and most importantly at the end, exits, those things take time to develop in other geographies where they haven't existed before. It's certainly not the case that they can't exist, and now there are other Silicon Valleys. In fact, Beijing in China, a huge opportunity for startups and a huge ecosystem. New York City in New York, a second Silicon Valley in the US. Bangalore in India, here in Mexico City, and other places in Europe as well. There are plenty of other Silicon Valleys that are developing. So it's certainly not the case that Silicon Valley is the only place in the world where there's a concentration of capital and talent. One of the things I want to point out is there's lots of different players in that ecosystem. We 500 startups operate primarily at the incubation and seed stage level, but there's lots of investors in these overall Silicon Valley ecosystem, and it's really mostly the investor side of the ecosystems around the world which take developing. In fact, it's very typical that a lot of investors in global markets complain about the entrepreneurs. Our entrepreneurs aren't talented enough, they need more experience, they don't have enough talent as much as Silicon Valley, and that's a bunch of bullshit. Actually, particularly here in Mexico City, that is not true. Tec de Monterrey, and there's tons of engineers, marketers, and designers in Mexico that have tremendous amounts of talent and experience and are quite capable as entrepreneurs, and we've put our money where our mouth is in investing here in Mexico in the belief of that. What's actually the challenge? Access to investors, access to capital. It's really the investor side of the equation that is actually most challenging. There's not enough investors. There's not enough experience in those investors. Those investors aren't risk takers in the market, and they're not experienced putting their money to work. That's really where the challenge is. And so if we look at what does it take to really get these ecosystems off the ground, in order to develop mature company IPOs, you might have to start with 1,000 companies. 1,000 companies bootstrapping themselves to get off the ground. Out of those, maybe 300 might make it to the accelerator stage or get a product out the door. From there, maybe 100 get to seed stage and raise, some substantial amount of capital. And then traditional venture coming in, there might be, further fall-off and attrition. But that type of funnel is what's necessary. It's not just the entrepreneurs that are necessary, it's also the investors, angel investors, seed funds, and Series A funds, and then later stage. So when we think about education on the entrepreneur side, sure, there's a lot of important things. What one thing is not so important? A business plan. Actually, why do I say that? Business plans are for traditional companies with known operational procedures and known outcomes. Laundry businesses, car companies, manufacturing businesses. Those are good businesses to build business plans. Why? Because you know how they operate. You know how they end up. With startups, you don't know how they operate. You don't know who the customers are, you don't know who the technology is, you don't have a lot of things figured out. Business plans, not so useful for startups. You're over-optimizing for outcomes that aren't going to happen. What is useful? Functional prototypes, unit economics, marketing plans. How do I build the product? How do I get it to customers? And what are the functional unit economics of cost in building products and delivering them, and the revenue that I generate from getting to those customers? On the investor side, what's important? Number one thing, startups are not real estate. They're not real estate. Most startups fail. And actually, sometimes a lot of real estate fails too. But the traditional real estate investor probably expects that 70% or more of their real estate investments are going to make money. And they're going to make money at a modest level, maybe 5 to 20% growth per year. What's the case with startups? Most startups fail. More than half of them fail. Probably more than 60 to 70% of them don't return very much capital. But what's unique about startups is probably 20 to 30% of them work really well, and maybe 5 to 10% of them work fantastically well. So what happens when you're investing in startups? You lose your money on probably 50 to 80% of your investments. You make 5x on maybe 15 to 20% of your investments, and you might make 10 to 20 to 50x on 1, 2 to 5% of your investments. So what does that mean? It means you probably need 10 to 20 investments to have a shot at getting one of those home runs. That's what's different about startups than real estate. Most investors don't understand this, and they invest in 1 or 2 startups. And they put a lot of money in those startups because they think they're going to have the next Instagram or the next WhatsApp or the next Facebook. And they're fantastically wrong. They are fantastically wrong. The commercial is that tech is easy and that startups are easy and you're going to make a bundle of money, and sometimes that happens, but most of the time that doesn't happen. What does happen very frequently is out of thousands of startups, a few succeed really well. And that's why you have to have a portfolio approach investing in tech. Startups are not real estate. Startups are not real estate. Anyway, I could talk about this a lot more, but I know we're out of time. Thank you for listening to me for a little bit. I'll leave you with one last slide, which is the market for startups is absolutely phenomenally large, and we have not even begun to embrace it. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of startups are possible every year, and we're just at the beginning of that game. Thank you.
That's okay. I think we have time for a few questions.
Okay.
I was writing down some things. Just to begin with, out of your experience in Mexico, what do you think are the hot topics for investment right now?
The hot topics for investment, things that make money. Actually, I don't mean that as a joke. I mean, right now, the hot topics are not messaging apps, in my opinion. They're not pictures and content apps, although there are plenty of those. They're simple e-commerce services and cloud-based SaaS services. So a lot of productivity and e-commerce tools, things that actually generate money right away. And companies that are building those products and services, they should probably be looking to solve problems for customers where they're willing to pay for those things.
Mm-hmm. And again, out of your experience, name 2 or 3 things that you would absolutely want to change in the ecosystem in Mexico for it to grow.
I think in general, there's been a lot of caution on the investor side of the equation in jumping into the market. And I think that's probably one of the things that I hope changes. Again, I think particularly there's been a lot of investors who will try 1 or 2 investments at typically larger dollar sizes. They might even put hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in. And much better approach is to figure out how much money you're going to invest in startups, probably divide that by 20, not by 2, and make 10 to 20 investments at that size, maybe reserve some money to do follow-on in the ones that are working. But I think there's too much people waiting around and waiting on the sidelines, and there's going to be a lot of great businesses built in Mexico. And the Spanish-speaking market is just absolutely huge and growing. All the macro factors for the people who are using the product, those are growing dramatically, much faster than the amount of investments growing.
And going into the 500 startups model, you said you had 750 investments?
Have about 750 investments. Probably 250 of those are dead. Probably 250 are struggling, but probably 250 we think we're going to make some money on. Of those 250 that are working, I expect we'll make a lot of money on 50 to 100 of them. So wow. You do have to have a very diversified approach. You don't necessarily have to have quite a diverse approach as we do. But still, we are bullish on the overall market, but we're cautious in the size of check that we invest.
But you guys brought a whole new perspective on how to invest in startups. How do you manage to invest so fast and to do it so globally?
Well, for us, we have about 12 people on the team who are making investments. We probably do about 20 investments a month, which is probably 2 per person per month. Most of the time when we're looking at products, it's a fairly simple decision. We're really trying to look for a functional product, some measurable amount of customer usage, not necessarily a lot, and hopefully some revenue. We'd like to see teams that are comprised of smart people, but primarily engineers, designers, and marketers. And then we're looking for a problem that they're solving that generates value for customers, value enough that they're willing to pay money for. So, we're really not trying to invent the next rocket ship. We're looking for things that are pretty clearly of value to customers and can be built, ideally on less than $1 million in just 1 or 2 years.
And who's taking care of the management of the portfolio and exits and everything?
A lot of people tend to overvalue the attention needed to invest in great companies. A lot of VCs tend to overthink that they are the value that they're bringing to the companies as opposed to their capital. In most scenarios and most companies that we invest in, the best companies don't need us as babysitters or advisors. They do need our capital, and sometimes they need our guidance, but probably they're teaching us as much as we're teaching them. So in general, the winners keep winning, the losers probably lose, and you probably don't need to manage the losers very much. That money's going to go to zero almost regardless of how much effort you put into it. So really we think the key challenge is finding smart people with products that are great for customers, writing them checks and letting them succeed.
Have you already funded somebody more than once?
We've definitely funded a few people more than once, but what probably is more interesting is we occasionally have this situation where entrepreneurs are investors in our fund, we're investors in their startup, and they're actually advisors and investors in other startups. We kind of call that the trifecta. We actually had one scenario where a company went through our accelerator. We invested in them. They went through our accelerator. They got bought by Google like within 6 months. And they actually invested in the same fund that they came out of, which was, pretty interesting and pretty great statement. So we're trying to build a very large community, and we want to bet on smart people. We have to necessarily make some mistakes because we're going to do that at scale. But we're believers that at least 10 to 20% of the time we're going to find some success, and hopefully that works out.
One last question. This could be a long one, but we've seen thousands of accelerators pop up in different countries. Do you think we're already in the post-accelerator era? What's coming?
A lot of people worry about whether there's too many accelerators, whether there's a bubble in accelerators, and I would just point out that there's probably several thousand business schools around the world. There's a lot of students who go to those business schools, and what do? They spend $50,000 to $100,000 a year reading about other people's success. I think that we as accelerators might give someone $50,000 to $100,000, and they might fail. But probably they will learn more about starting a business by failing at their own startup than reading about someone else's success. And so the $50,000 to $100,000 that they may fail and spend, probably a better education in a lot of cases than the MBA where they're reading about somebody else's success and paying for that. I'm sure I'm not getting any fans of the business school market right now, but I'm a big believer in lab, not theory.
Well, I think that's an excellent sentence to finish the panel, to finish the day. Please give him a big round of applause, and thank you for coming.